Hi, it's Brent Holland from Night Fright. Welcome to the show. We're beginning our JFK Assassination Month. This afternoon we've got Larry Hancock waiting on the phone for us, but first I'm going to prep the show by saying the JFK conspiracy is the biggest conspiracy in history. The consequences of President Kennedy's assassination resound even to today. Was it the work of one crazed lone assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, or were there others who knew about the assassination before it took place? This afternoon, renowned JFK researcher Larry Hancock has investigated how many people knew about the JFK assassination before it took place. Folks, you're never going to believe how many people knew JFK was going to be hit, and you'll never believe the names of who knew. This afternoon, it's the President Kennedy assassination. Oh, and by the way, all the rumors you have ever heard about the assassination are true. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time to question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Good afternoon, folks. Larry, are you there?
I'm here.
Hey, it works. I always hold my breath, Larry, when I have somebody on the phone, because there's so many buttons to push and stuff to make that happen. I'm always amazed that it does actually happen. So how are you this afternoon, my friend?
I'm doing pretty good, thank you.
That's great. Some event last night took place.
I'm pretty sure there was an election or something like that. Hey, I'm pretty good considering I stayed up late watching the results.
You're a trooper to come on the show today after all that. Do you want to talk a few minutes about that before we jump in?
No, I guess I, like most everyone else, just was up late, was excited, and I'm very pleased with the way things are going in the country, and feel good about it, and any drowsiness I might have retained after that late night was taken away by your intro music there, as well as the soundtrack. So that was really a great help.
You're a kind man, Larry. You're a kind man. I had the Marshalls going to 11 that day, the Marshall stacks of amplifiers. Larry, you've written a groundbreaking book, in my opinion. It's called Someone Would Have Talked, and it deals specifically with people that knew about the assassination prior to the assassination. I was wondering, just for the folks that don't know too much about your background in the book and things, maybe you could just give a brief synopsis about the book and perhaps a brief synopsis about your background as a writer.
You bet. I think, first off, a lot of people ask about the title of the book, and I really came across the title after being in the study of the assassination for probably about 15 years at that time. Obviously, one of the most common expressions you get from people that really don't know about or are loath to believe in a conspiracy is, obviously, if there was a conspiracy, someone would have to talk. Nobody could keep that sort of thing quiet, and certainly couldn't keep it quiet for all those years. So there really couldn't have been, or we'd know about it. And that just, after a while, began to drive me nuts. And that was really the genesis of the book. I think one of the things that you come across if you really study the subject in detail for a while is the fact that the actual evidence itself was literally so managed. The chain of evidence and provenance of most of the material is so broken. There's so much conflict about physical evidence, medical evidence, that again, it could drive you nuts after a while and leave you with the opinion that you could never make any progress. So after dealing with that for a decade or so, I decided to if you couldn't go in the front door with the evidence, you might take a look at going in the back door and looking at the people. And that's when I started literally looking at people who had talked or who had gossiped, who appeared to have leaked information, and that led me to probably spend the next 5 or 6 years really evaluating people and trying to determine people that I thought could be corroborated, who were credible. And once I got through that and parsed it down to a few people that looked like were indeed very credible, I started on the book and started on the book from the bottoms up, seeing where those people would take me with no real assumption about motive or means, or just building it from the bottom up on their comments. And as I say, that makes the book a little bit different because it wasn't written with any theory in mind. It started with those people, and I just ended up where it took me.
It's a very well-written book. Folks, we are speaking with Larry Hancock, and Larry Hancock is a terrific JFK researcher. He's done incredible research revealing who knew about the assassination prior to the assassination. He's got a great book out called Someone Would Have Talked, and we're lucky to have him here on Sudbury Radio, local radio. And you're listening to CKLU 96.7 FM, www.cklu.ca on the internet. We are now streaming, talking about John Martino. And I was wondering, Larry, if you could just pick it up from there.
Sure, I will do that, Brent.
Thank you.
But one of the things we want to come back to is actually Martino represents, I would say, one tier of people that knew about the assassination in advance, and I'll try to detail how and why. But it's interesting in that there are at least two more tiers, including a group of people within the Secret Service and closer to the Kennedy family that actually knew that JFK was at risk before the assassination. No specific details, perhaps, but certainly knew he was at risk in a couple of the different places he was traveling to at the time. But to return to John Martino, he basically is the person that I ended up with after going through 12 to 15 different people who had some knowledge or claimed some knowledge of the assassination, of the conspiracy, and I ended up discounting most all of them for one reason or the other. One of the things that makes Martino unique is that Martino, and this is a good test of people, Martino certainly didn't say anything revealing his knowledge of a conspiracy in a manner that would have ever gone public, would have incriminated him, would have made him a danger to anyone else, and that's kind of a key. The only reason, really two reasons that we know about him are the fact that shortly before his death, he did make some comments to some very long-time friends of his about not only being aware of a conspiracy, but actually being personally involved at a low level in supporting the conspiracy against the president. And one of those individuals anonymously went to the House Select Committee on Assassinations back in the mid-'70s when they...
Maybe we could just stop there for a second. You can just explain what that was for the folks that aren't familiar with that.
You bet. The House Select Committee was formed by the U.S. Congress to, after Watergate and after a lot of people had become suspicious about government answers to things, to go back and investigate the Kennedy and King and Robert Kennedy murders. And actually, they did do investigation work on both JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. They didn't really get around to Robert Kennedy. But that committee was the second official government effort to deal with the Kennedy assassination, and in the end did render a verdict or a judgment that there'd been a conspiracy involved, which people who talk about the assassination tend to bring up the fact the Warren Commission found no sign of conspiracy, but most everyone forgets to mention the fact that the actual most recent government investigation concluded there was a conspiracy.
Yeah, people are shocked to find that out. They're not aware of that. The people I've spoke to aren't aware of the fact that they did find a conspiracy in the JFK assassination case.
And one of the most interesting things is that as empowered by Congress, they actually formally went to the U.S. Justice Department and gave them their finding and asked for the U.S. Justice Department to pursue a a criminal detailed investigation and literally were simply ignored.
Thanks for that, Larry. That's very, very well explained to the folks that weren't aware of that.
Back to John Martino, one of the sources, one of Martino's friends, anonymously went to the House Select Committee to alert them to the fact that he had talked with a man who claimed to have inside knowledge. And after a few months, a couple of the committee members actually convinced him to declare himself and to reveal who he was and give his background. And the House Select Committee did attempt to do an investigation on John Martino, went to his family and essentially said, well, we've been told that he was involved in the assassination. And obviously, the answer to that would be, if someone showed up at your front door, would be to go, what? And essentially, the family and John's wife, who was still alive, declined to have any knowledge of that. And after a rather cursory investigation, just one of many leads, the House Select Committee was not able to go any further. And then, unfortunately, they just did not have access to all of the documents, all of the information that we have now. I've talked with one of the HSC investigators who said, simply, if they knew what we knew now, they would have taken an entirely different direction, and he felt that they would have stood a very good chance to crack it, but they just didn't know. And nobody was sharing any information with them at the time. As a matter of fact, when they would go and inquire about some possible contacts, they would be simply told that those people didn't exist. And now, of course, we know that they did, and we'll talk about a couple of those later. But to make a long story short on John Martino, John Martino had been a prisoner in Cuba. He had been imprisoned by Castro and spent the better part of 3 years in a Cuban prison. He had been in prison because he was working with a casino there and had been making trips back and forth. His specialty was electronics, or perhaps more specifically, how to manipulate electronic equipment in casinos. And he certainly had a long career in doing that, and in gambling and in racetracks and in that arena. And he was making trips in and out of Cuba, probably at that time as a courier. And he was picked up, imprisoned, and actually his son was with him at the time. Edward Martino was his son, and his son was retained in a Cuban jail for some time before his mother was allowed to come pick him up. But
around what year was this?
59.
59, okay.
This was just really after the revolution, and as Castro was leaning towards, displaying as a more radical control over the country than had been first thought. At first, people were going back and forth thinking it was relatively safe, but it became less so.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
What are some of the things that Edward Martino, John Martino's son, heard John say on that fateful day, November 22nd, 1963?
Right. Yeah, that was one of the more solid things that we have, is that the family actually heard, not just Edward, but the family, the wife and the family, heard John Martino mention before the assassination that JFK would likely be killed on his trip to Dallas. They had been listening to a news broadcast of the upcoming travel of the president, and Martino just blurted out while they were listening to it at the dinner table that they were going to kill him when he got to Dallas. And at first the family didn't, they thought, well, perhaps he's just talking about the fact that JFK was not thought well of in Texas or something like that. But then on the actual day of the assassination, Edward was very much surprised because his father asked him to stay home, or told him to stay home from school. And of course, he was a senior in high school at the time, and if your dad says, you stay home from school today, this is a good thing. And but he was surprised because there was no reason for it. And his dad said, well, I'm going to be painting in the living room, but I don't even want you to help me. I just want you to watch television, and if anything unusual happens, come get me. So Ed did, and once the news of the assassination came through, he went to see his dad, who just kind of turned white and was on the telephone for the rest of the afternoon, getting calls and making calls. And
unbelievable,
yeah, that was very, very shocking. And it was at that point in time, certainly, that they became aware that there was something going on that they had not known about. And Edward did not talk to anyone, nor did his mother. And his mother actually talked to a researcher shortly before her death, and that's the first time. This was decades later that we really started getting an insight into the fact that the House Select Committee had just missed it, that there was more here and more to look into. But yes, Edwards, I got in touch with Ed several years ago when he's got to be comfortable and started providing more information, and he's actually gotten to the point where he's related some of his personal experiences and allowed me to quote him in the book. And actually, he will be speaking at our conference in Dallas that's coming up in November, our annual JFK Research Conference.
Please do plug that if you wouldn't mind for folks that would like to go.
Oh, yes. It's we do it annually in November. It's a combination history, JFK administration, and JFK Conspiracy Research Conference. And this year it will be the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, and all the details are available at the jfklancer.com website. And we have a host of really good speakers this year because it is the 45th anniversary. So we have several history professors, several prominent researchers who will be coming in Dallas to address the conference.
It's something that's been put together, like you said, for the past 20 years, bringing all types of researchers converging in one area, and they relate their research. People pick out pieces of the puzzle. It's all putting a puzzle together, and the amount of research that has been done in the last 45 years is astounding, absolutely astounding. Some of the research our guest today has done, Larry Hancock, he's written a groundbreaking book called Someone Would Have Talked, which is available through Amazon, and the JFK Lancer website, which is www.jfklancer.com. Some of that research involves Joe Marshall Smith, Dallas police officer. I was wondering if you could relate to the folks that story. That's a pretty, for me, that's a smoking gun to say for sure that there was indeed a conspiracy.
Well, actually, Joe, it's just one of several of the Dallas police officers that after a period of time, did feel comfortable with talking, with relating their experiences. I'm just curious, Brent, what particular about Joe struck you versus the others? I'd be interested to know.
Well, to me, it's a police officer. So right away, he's used to testifying, if you will, and observing under traumatic events. And certainly that was one traumatic event. And the fact that he got behind the grassy knoll and somebody came up to him with credentials saying they were a Secret Service agent, only to be found out later that indeed there was no Secret Service anywhere in that area, indeed not in Dealey Plaza itself. So to me, that's a concrete example of intelligence of some sort, because to make up those type of documents, it's just not Joe average, that's for sure. You have to have inside information.
I thought that's what it was going to be, and I think I can expand on that a little bit. It's interesting that when the Warren Commission would have had its statement, if the Warren Commission had been listening to him, perhaps the first thought might have been, well, these are Secret Service. These are, this is not an unusual experience, and even to Smith himself, you wouldn't be surprised to find people there. It wasn't until years later when you could go through all the data and find out that all the Secret Service people were accounted for and none of them were back there, that you would begin to wonder. And then the the House Select Committee looked into that, and they thought that perhaps it would have been military intelligence or something like that, and they investigated it and found no, they weren't supposed to be there either. And so some of those things at the time, certainly to Smith, it was reasonable, and it wasn't even mysterious for some years later until you could pull all of those bits and pieces together. I will tell you that actually a Canadian researcher did some further work on that, and he found another police officer who was one of the early officers up the knoll. I discussed this in my book, who had run behind the fence and was starting to search behind the fence. And an officer came up to him and said, you're wasting your time. There's no reason to be behind the fence here. I've been stationed here for the last 2 hours. There hasn't been anybody here. You guys need to go look over there, like towards the school book depository. And that officer recognized this officer, and so again, he didn't take it amiss. So he turned around as others did and went the other direction. Well, only years later, when we sorted through the official police assignments, did we find that there were no police assigned back there. The police coverage ended a block away up on Houston Street. And so that if that officer was there, that was not his assigned duty area, and it becomes very suspicious. So when the officer was recontacted about and told that, the officer stopped speaking and never would identify the individual.
Well, I guess a lot of the reason why people shut up was because there were so many witnesses being killed. It was unbelievable, the amount of potential witnesses that were having heart attacks all of a sudden, or committing suicide with the wrong hand, et cetera, under mysterious circumstances.
It started relatively early. I think one of the most dramatic ones that has scared people away and scared people locally was a man named Bowers, who was actually watching from a control tower in the train lot and behind it. And although his death has been debated, there is no doubt that within a year, within not much more of a year, he died rather dramatically in a car accident. And I know people, including Deborah Conway at JFK Lancer, who interviewed members of his family and said that he had absolutely told them that he had seen more of what went on behind the fence than he told the Warren Commission, because when he went to start telling the Warren Commission about the people that he had seen, it became pretty clear to him that they really weren't interested in going into detail, and they really didn't want to hear it. And being a smart fellow, it's sort of like, well, if they don't want to hear it, I don't want to be talking about this. And interestingly enough, this is one of these mysteries that you never can prove. He had some correspondence with a young Canadian, and who was I think a teenager at the time, who wrote him and wanted to know what he had seen. And unfortunately, the young man didn't retain the correspondence because he really didn't realize what Bowers was saying to him. But apparently, he says Bowers wrote to him and talked to him about the fact that he had actually seen men behind the fence and a man with a rifle and a man shooting.
Oh, I didn't know Bowers had said that.
Well, supposedly, and supposedly, he told the young man that he was scared to talk. It's one of those things. People do talk. People have an urge to talk about things, but who do you talk to and remain safe? And apparently, he just thought it was safe. It wasn't safe to tell the Warren Commission, but if you tell a Canadian teenager, how is it going to come back on you? So you may tell it to your family, or you may let it slip in a letter. And of course, the fellow kicked himself because he didn't save the letter. But we do know, again, like I say, from his family members, that he definitely felt threatened and had seen more that. And then after his death, of course, other witnesses would immediately go, well, it would be best for me not to say anything. I would just go along with the official story.
Just for folks that aren't aware of what the Warren Commission was, there was a commission for the 9/11. They looked at the tragedy on 9/11, and there was a report given out, a government report. The Warren Commission was much the same thing for the Kennedy assassination. They investigated to see if there was indeed a conspiracy. Back in 1964, it was put together a few months after the Kennedy assassination, and they came to the conclusion that it was one lone killer, Lee Harvey Oswald. It was kind of a bastardized investigation. They didn't follow leads, and they pretty much had their conclusion and ignored things that didn't purport to their conclusion. If you want to jump in, sure, go ahead.
It's interesting now that we have seen so many documents released. It's fascinating to go back and really look at the work of the commission and compare that to their official conclusions. And we now know, because we can see their internal dialogues and some of their internal discussions, even though in some of their internal discussions they say, well, we're afraid, we shouldn't even be discussing this and let anybody write it down. And then there's a blank. And so you begin to wonder, what was it that they felt so bad about that they didn't even want a transcript made for an internal record? One of the things there is a record of course, is that they discuss among themselves and agree that they're totally dependent upon the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. And if, for example, Lee Oswald was actually an FBI informant, they know that there's no way that Hoover would ever tell them. And so basically you can kind of see them shrug their shoulders during the meeting and just kind of give up on that point. But perhaps as interesting are some of the documents that show that their staff members would go meet with people. For example, they convened a committee of ballistics experts and had 2 or 3 meetings with them, and this panel of ballistics experts, essentially on 2 or 3 different occasions, everyone agreed that the so-called magic bullet theory of how they were coming up with, of how the president had actually been killed and one bullet had gone through Kennedy and finally the whole committee essentially said this can't be true. And then you read the report that's taken back to the Warren Commission, and the staff member overrides that and says, well, my conclusion is. His conclusion is totally at odds with what all these professionals and medical people are saying, but what gets entered into the record is his conclusion rather than theirs.
That's right. Yep.
So you rapidly begin to see that the commission is following an agenda.
It's funny because one of the members of that commission, before he was president, was President Ford. He was one of the members that was investigating the JFK assassination. He sat in on the Warren Commission in 1964. And the autopsy report revealed that there was a shot in President Kennedy's back. And it would be about, take your neckline and then go down about 7 inches and about 2.5 inches over, 3 inches over. And that's where the shot was. Well, President Ford, in his genius, if you will, put that in quotations, decided to move that bullet wound up to the back of the small of his head to try and make it look like the wound had entered the back of his head. He moved that all by himself. And when later questioned about it, his answer was, well, I wanted to make it look that way so the evidence would match up. Unbelievable.
Well, that was sincere, I suppose.
And this guy went on to be president. It's kind of scary.
Well, it's sort of, so here you have a staff member deciding that he can override a panel of medical and ballistics experts, and Ford deciding that he will move the bullet wound where it needs to move. You can sort of assume that the conclusion would be in doubt.
I guess future presidents are never wrong.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
This afternoon, folks, we are very pleased to welcome to Night Fright renowned researcher with a groundbreaking book called Someone Would Have Talked, Larry Hancock. And we're discussing the JFK assassination, of course. If you're just joining us, it's 45 years. 45 years, unbelievable, since JFK was assassinated. And what we know now is concrete evidence it was indeed a conspiracy. Even the government has come out and said it was a conspiracy. In the late 70s, there was another commission investigating three prominent assassinations that had taken place in the 60s, which was the JFK assassination, Martin Luther King, and then Bobby Kennedy. In the JFK assassination, the final report was a probable conspiracy, and it was never followed up by any government since. As I said this afternoon, we're speaking on CKLU.ca, 96.7 FM, with Larry Hancock. And Larry, I was wondering if we could go back into the people who knew beforehand and maybe talk a little bit about Rose Jeremy?
Oh, certainly. And Rose Jeremy will take us to another tier of people.
Super.
That there's one tier even within the government where there was knowledge of a threat to JFK. There's a tier that we just talked about with John Martino of those people that were at least involved or peripheral to the conspiracy that knew what was going on. And there's a third tier, and Rose Jeremy represents that, of people that simply, they're not in government, they're not in the conspiracy, they're hearing rumors, they're hearing gossip, they know something is happening, they really have no personal insight to it. And I think this is, whether you call this a leak or not, there was talk in certain circles, among certain Cuban exiles, among certain people that had been involved in the old Havana gambling network, casino network. There was talk and gossip that JFK was going to be quote unquote hit. And Rose Jeremy is an example of that. Rose certainly wasn't in any great position to have any insider knowledge. Rose Jeremy had been a prostitute, was involved in fairly low-level drug running and smuggling, and primarily across the South. She had worked in Miami, she'd worked in Texas, she was from Louisiana, kind of trafficked the southern route going from Miami to Dallas. And her information surfaced very shortly after the assassination, because the police became aware of the fact that she had been taken into custody essentially because she had been found wandering on a roadway and clearly was under the effects of drugs, and she'd been placed in jail. And the Louisiana police took her to be treated at a medical facility, but on 2 or 3 occasions during that period of time, and this is immediately prior to November 22nd, she made remarks about having been traveling with men who were talking about the fact that the president was going to be killed in Dallas, and something was specifically going to happen in Dallas. And this was heard by police officers, it was heard by medical personnel, and this was reported afterwards. And interestingly enough, the police officer, Lieutenant Purget of the Louisiana State Patrol, reported it to his superior, along with the fact that Jeremy was providing some other information about drug trafficking. And so they decided to work with Customs and investigate her drug lead, because she had some very specific information on a drug run that was being made that she'd been involved in. And they wanted to break that. But his superior ended up calling the Dallas police and giving them the story and telling them that they had some really solid information from a person with advanced knowledge, apparently, that something was going to happen in Dallas. And basically, apparently, the Dallas police officer being talked to simply said, well, they had the man who had done it, and they were done with their investigation, and they just really weren't interested.
Unbelievable, eh? They would just ignore it like that, not even take the report.
That it is But the police officer is on record of there's very little doubt that happened, and indeed, the Louisiana Police and Customs went on to check out her drug lead, and which took them to Houston, Texas, by the way, and all the elements of her information checked out. She named people in Dallas, she named people in Houston, all of those leads checked out, and the reason it came to naught, apparently, and this we've only found out fairly recently, is it might have led to a major drug bust, but they had put her under surveillance in the hotel where the trade was supposed to be made under surveillance, but apparently when they intercepted the people coming off the freighter with the drugs, the customs agents literally lost the trail, and they lost people, blew the whole drug bust, and when you look at the documents, it becomes obvious that as soon as that happens, nobody really wants to talk about this anymore, and the whole thing is closed out.
I didn't know that ending part. I knew she had named the freighter, and the freighter was there, and like you said, all the information was correct. She had relayed about the drug bust. I didn't know it fell apart at the end.
Yeah, I added that in an appendix to my book because we did fairly recently come across this new series of customs documents that reveal how seriously they had taken it. But the interesting thing is the customs documents talked about how seriously they pursued it. Then we found a report from the police officer, the Louisiana patrol officer, who said what really happened. And he's the one that acknowledges that the bust failed because they lost their surveillance on the smuggler. The customs reports don't say that, which is one thing that you learn after reading a certain number of government documents, is that if somebody makes a mistake, it's usually not in the report.
That's great research, Larry.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
We are speaking with Larry Hancock, renowned JFK researcher, and he's got a terrific book out called Someone Would Have Talked, which is available online at Amazon, or you can also go to the JFK Lancer research website, which is www.jfklancer.com, and you can order it right through there. We're talking about the JFK assassination here on CKLU, and we are now streaming. You can reach us at www.cklu.ca and just click on that streaming link. Larry, let's continue on with Rose Cherami, essentially what happened to her afterwards, because she died under, again, mysterious circumstances.
Right. It's very sad in a way, because basically they had the Louisiana Patrol customs officer and some folks from Houston had taken her to Houston to participate in this drug bust, and as you study the documents, they're taking her very seriously. They've checked out her record, they've checked out the records of the people that she's named and confirmed that they're all in the drug business. The reason that she was in this position at the time and doing the drug deal was it becomes clear that someone in Dallas was actually holding her young child hostage until she finished the drug deal.
That's right, blackmail. Yeah.
The person is named, and that verified that this person is active in the drug trade. So it looks like a very serious case in the records up until the point in time where apparently they blow it. And at that point in time, the records simply say that she was put back on the street. Nobody did anything further to assist her. No idea what happened to her child.
Awful.
It's very clear that she did have a child. The police officer that picked her up remarked that among her effects when he picked her up was a box of baby clothes.
That's right. Yeah.
She had just been dumped out on the side of the road because apparently she had gotten into an argument with the men that she was traveling with, who were involved in prostitution. And this was investigated during the Garrison investigation, which we might talk about later. But in any event, so the law enforcement folks just gave it up at that point in time, dumped her back on the street, and apparently she went back to her regular routine of being involved in some minor drug traffic and prostitution. But within, a few years, a relatively short period of time, she turned up again on another highway in Louisiana, this same kind of drug route that had been used for some time. She was found by the side of the road, and the official verdict was that she had been run over. Now, a study of the documents revealed that she probably was run over, but it probably wasn't a simple accident, and there was blunt force trauma, and she was probably unconscious when she was run over, and was murdered because there were a lot of mysterious deaths in this, but the mysterious deaths that are really the most obvious and likely are the people that, if there had been a real investigation, could have been called into court. And that's one way to weigh the so-called mysterious death. If it's someone who could have actually been called into court and given testimony that would have been at odds with what the Warren Commission reported out, then the mysterious death is something you should take serious.
Absolutely. I never thought of it like that. That's very good. Yeah, that's true too. If they could testify, they were going to be a target, big time.
Applies to several of the mysterious deaths in Dallas. Probably the earliest mysterious deaths and disappearances were those people that knew that Jack Ruby wasn't the simple person that the Warren Commission portrayed him to be. And those people that knew too much about Jack Ruby or about a possible Ruby Oswald connection were definitely at risk.
Jack Ruby, folks, JFK was killed on a Friday, the 22nd, and on the 24th, which was a Sunday, Jack Ruby, a known mafioso, decided to kill Oswald. He had been stalking Oswald all weekend. Jack Ruby was a renowned mafioso in Dallas. You had mentioned Jim Garrison before. I was wondering, do you feel like talking about him now?
Oh, sure. That is the one of the interim investigations, I guess. We talked about the official Warren Committee investigation and the later House Select Committee, but in between those two, just a few years after the Warren Commission, starting around 1967, District Attorney Garrison in New Orleans became involved in an investigation of the conspiracy, and Garrison determined that there were people in New Orleans that were in contact with Oswald and very likely could have been suspects in the conspiracy in Dallas, and certainly were people that did know Oswald and were doing some things that were pretty suspicious, and this had not come out during the Warren Commission. So
that's right.
Just all by himself as district attorney, he launched an investigation and gained national prominence by essentially reopening the case in New Orleans.
Just to interrupt you for a sec, Larry, just as a point of reference, folks, if you've ever seen the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, which is a sensational movie, that is the story of the Jim Garrison investigation, basically in a nutshell. There are some artistic licenses that Oliver Stone took, but basically that is a fantastic movie. If you're ever at the video store, you're looking for something to rent, this is a fabulous movie because it puts all the lore out there and all the facts and everything. Kevin Costner is the one who plays Jim Garrison and guides us through his whole investigation. And now back to Larry Hancock.
And it's one heck of a movie, too. It'll keep you on the edge of your seat for 2.5 hours.
Yeah, fabulous. Absolutely.
Regardless of anything else. The cut that you have in your introduction, I think, was taken from the movie.
I should have mentioned that. Yeah, you're right.
It's so dramatic that it's a fantastic movie. And I can remember at the time, the question around the United States, at least, was what in the world would an attorney, what does New Orleans have to do with the murder in Dallas?
In Dallas.
And nobody could really puzzle through that. And I can remember hearing news announcements about it and my parents and everyone just shaking their head because we couldn't understand what it could possibly have to do with Dallas. But of course, not really understanding that Oswald himself was from Louisiana, and Oswald had been in New Orleans the year before the assassination, and not understanding any of those connections that Garrison was establishing, it didn't make much sense until you really got into it, and Garrison really didn't have the opportunity to get his story out that well in the national media. And it gets pretty detailed because one of the reasons he didn't is certainly some of the people that appear to have been suspects in the real conspiracy volunteered to help Garrison and turned out to be helpful, all right, but certainly helpful in pointing him in many wrong directions.
Very much so. Very much so. That's exactly it. Larry, you mentioned the 60s. Can we try and give the vibe, the feeling? There's a 60s word right there, because I'm from that vintage also. Groovy, man. Can you try and give people, the younger folks that are listening, an indication of what the feeling was around JFK? I think it's pretty similar to Obama. Obama has a lot of that Camelot feel to him, and all of a sudden he was struck down. And what did it do to the country, to the world, in fact?
Well, I think there was a huge amount of charisma. And the thing is that JFK, as much as we have today, was basically appealing to the better side of the American public, and was just kind of generally regarded as, whether you liked him or not, he was a very social president. He was a real presence. Jackie Kennedy was tremendously admired and respected, and the Kennedy administration was very cultured, very, as I say, it's social. In those days, there were parties and things going on in Washington, D.C. around the Kennedys all the time. It was a very open environment. There was no security that we would know of today, and it was really very much a first family. And you may remember, I certainly remember the comedy routines built around the first family, and they were teased and made fun of, but it was pretty good fun. Mm-hmm. And it was obviously at the height of the Cold War, so it wasn't that things were not tense for other reasons, and he dealt with a lot of very nasty things like the missile crisis and Cuban matters. But as far as the presidency itself, it was very positive and very upbeat, and though he had a lot of political opposition, the country felt pretty good about itself. And when this happened, when the assassination happened, all of a sudden the country felt very bad about itself. And actually, I think, from my personal perspective, one of the reasons it was so quick to accept a lone assassin was that was an easy answer. That was it. It was psychologically very comfortable to blame it on a lone nut. Mm-hmm. And make it as simple as possible. And everyone from the Dallas police to beyond was happy with that. Well, it's really sad, but it was a lone nut, and we caught him, and it's all done, and so we can move on. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's what you were looking for, Brent, but
yes, it was. Yeah, just so they can understand those tumultuous times during the 60s, to try and give people something to reference. Jim Garrison then went on to his investigation. I think it was 1967 he started, and it was 68 when it finally went to trial.
He started towards the end of 66. It really became public in 67. Mm-hmm. And I think another thing to give a feel for the 60s, at that point in time, one of the reasons he met with a lot of skepticism is, at that point in time, the population believed the government. And,
that's right.
And
bingo.
It was just accepted that mm-hmm. that they would not withhold information and they wouldn't lie to you. And this was before Watergate, and this was before we found out that they did. And so it was a much less skeptical time. And Garrison was kind of the transition between the two. Garrison was, but it's interesting, Lee Oswald has been described by some people that were very close to him as a proto-hippie. And I suppose Garrison might be described as a proto-skeptic, not taking the government answer, being suspicious of the government. Mm-hmm. And he was greatly reviled for that. And then a few years later, we went through Watergate, and everybody went, oh, yeah, okay. We don't believe it either. So Garrison's timing was just really bad. But I would say, and we can go as far as into you'd like, fairly familiar with Garrison investigation, and some of the characters that I've looked at certainly figure in that. But one of the things that you can't argue about the Garrison investigation is that he indeed did what I would say cut the trail, and that he proved conclusively that Lee Oswald was not a lone nut.
That's right.
Lee Oswald, associated with a number of suspicious people, was involved in a number of activities with intelligence connections, that there was, without a doubt, both FBI and CIA interest in Lee Oswald at the time, proved without a doubt that Lee Oswald was not an unknown factor to the government long before Dallas happened. And because of all that, he was a huge threat to both the FBI and the CIA in terms of exposing the information that they had not shared with the Warren Commission. And we now have a variety of documents showing how active, in particular, the FBI was in countering his investigation, in actually providing information to the people that he decided to prosecute. It's rather striking that during the actual trial that Garrison brought to court, the U.S. government transported one of the Kennedy autopsy doctors down to New Orleans, put him in a warehouse for 2 days, and briefed and debriefed him, because Garrison had one of the other doctors on the stand and was doing so much to bring the doctor's testimony into question that they were going to hand the other doctor over to the defense as a counter. Now, all of that is totally in violation of anything that the government agency is supposed to be doing, but now we know it to be true.
Yep.
It's in the documents.
They got right in there. Folks, this afternoon we are speaking to renowned JFK researcher Larry Hancock. Larry has a great book out, groundbreaking work, called Someone Would Have Talked, and it deals specifically with everybody who knew about the assassination prior to the assassination. You can get it at the JFK Lancer website, which is www.jfklancer.com, and Lancer was the code name given to JFK by the Secret Service, and Jacqueline Kennedy's code name was Lace, Lancer and Lace. It is also available through Amazon.com. I recommend this book highly. The research is profound, absolutely profound, and it's stunning. We're just revealing a little bit, the tip of the iceberg, if you will, of what is contained in the book. Larry's been a researcher for many years. He is also going to be presenting at a JFK Lancer conference coming up in Dallas. Again, if you're interested in going down to Dallas to attend this conference, you can go to the Lancer website, which again is www.jfklancer.com, and get all the information there. And I urge you, if you can go, because all the top-notch researchers will be there, and you're going to learn a lot and just to experience it all. And I'm sure Larry will be there, and if you bring his book, I'm sure he'd be happy to autograph it for you. There's a plug.
I would, and we even give one of the things about the conference, of course, is in Dallas. And for those people who are interested and never have been to Dallas and to the crime scene and to Dealey Plaza, we spend a lot of time there. We do guided tours, and it's a way to become personally involved in it, I guess. So if you're involved in either the mystery, or if you're interested in the Kennedy administration or the 60s, it's certainly a personal experience as well.
Well, there's a question, Larry. You mentioned personal experience. Why should people care in 2008, soon to be 2009, about an event that took place in 1963 that may seem to have no relevance?
A question many of my relatives ask me. No, just kidding. That does come up now and again, though. And I'm like, why would you people still be doing this 45 years later?
Yes.
I think there's some very, very serious answers to that, though. One has to do with citizenship and citizenship in any democracy, and the fact that simply becoming aware of this and studying it and studying the research that's been done on it is a great education in how government works and how important it is to find your own facts about what's going on in your country.
Exactly.
You had mentioned various U.S. government commissions, and I think one of the things it's taught us is that it's just a fact of life that any event like this does bring, any crisis brings a knee-jerk reaction in government. and that's just the state of affairs. And it clearly shows that government commissions are not effective at investigating government agencies.
Very
and
much
that's
so.
as relevant to us now as it was 45 years ago, because just the average citizen tends to accept those things at face value, and it just demonstrates the need for independent fact-checking, whether it's on a news release or has to do with an election. It's a very educational thing about being a citizen and about dealing with the media and just kind of dealing with life in general. So part of it is if you study this, I think it will help you deal with reality more effectively. It certainly will help any of those those folks that might have been interested in the 60s or in the Cold War. There's a historical component to it as well. One of the fascinating things is that, and we haven't mentioned this, you mentioned the movie JFK. That the movie resulted in several different things, one of which was the JFK Records Act in the United States. And the JFK Records Act was passed during the Clinton administration and literally resulted in the release of millions of pages of documents pertaining to the JFK assassination, but most of them are not necessarily investigation documents. They're historical documents about Cuban affairs, and they're essentially a historical record of the 1960s, and they're a huge resource to historians. But the other thing they are is they're a way to educate yourself on the way that the government still does operate.
Excellent point.
It's a wealth of information that professional historians are just beginning to tap, because no one has ever seen government documents in this depth and breadth for any period of history before. And I'm not sure that you ever will again, because the government just doesn't really like releasing these things.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's another reason why it's important, because certainly to people of historical bent, but I think the other thing, and this is, I will give a warning along those lines, these documents have all become publicly available, and they're available on the internet. There is JFK Lancer has lots and lots of documents available.
Fantastic website, folks. I heard you.
On my book website. Yeah. And we haven't mentioned the Mary Farrell Foundation.
Oh, let's do that, yes.
The Mary Farrell Foundation is named after a lady in Dallas who was one of what we call the first generation, the people who decided about 24 hours after the assassination that a lot of what they were hearing was starting to change, and they became skeptics about the official story and Oswald as a lone nut. Mary Farrell had been a legal secretary in Dallas and knew a lot of the high-level oil people and movers and shakers in Dallas, and it's reputed that one of the reasons she was skeptical is she knew how strongly they felt negatively towards JFK and was kind of wondering if some of them might have been involved in what happened. But she amassed over the next several decades a huge collection of documents, books, that sort of thing, and eventually it ended up, after her death, being pulled into a foundation, and right now the Mary Farrell Foundation has well over 1 million pages of documents online, and they're not just online, but they're searchable. And for those who are familiar with the term data mining, that means that you can actually search with any character string, a name, a word, or whatever, and essentially mine 1 million pages of government documents. And again, the impact on that for historical research, or just to teach yourself how different bureaus and agencies operate, is amazing.
Can you tell us, Larry, who put that together? It was Rex Bradford and Tyler?
Right, Rex Bradford and Tyler Weaver, and Tyler is the kind of administrator of the Mary Farrell Foundation, and Rex is the the webmaster, document guru. I can remember going to JFK Lancer conferences a decade ago when we talked about the possibility of using web programming to make a document available. And at that point in time, it seems amazing. It's just, it was being talked at as a concept. And now within only a few years later, it's a fact.
Incredible, isn't it? Isn't it great?
And it really is incredible.
It sure is. We are so lucky.
The reason I say a warning, it's because the internet for something like this is a fantastic research source. But you can also do Google searches on the internet about the JFK assassination and come up with a huge amount of information that may or may not be true. Yeah. And obviously it's a personal opinion, but there's a lot of bad information out there.
Some of it could be bogus.
It could be bogus.
Yeah.
So the documents and the ability to get to the documents and to do primary research is a wonderful thing. The ability to misinform yourself, perhaps using the internet, is not so wonderful. So you have, again, just as you had to be a skeptic and critical of the commissions and the investigations, you have to be critical of us researchers too.
Question everything.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
One of the things, Larry, in our pre-production meeting you had mentioned to me, and I love this, and I'm going to quote you on it. This is from Larry Hancock directly. Responsibility for the truth empowers the individual. What a fantastic quote. And it is so true. If you're looking for a reason to care about this thing that happened in 1963, that's why. Because in democracy, each one of us is responsible. I have friends from Iran, and the government's responsible there. They have fled Iran and are living in Canada. And it's a different concept because we are the government. The government is us, and that's the difference with a democracy as opposed to a theocracy or tyranny or fascism or whatever. We are responsible for ourselves. That's the bottom line, and we can't always trust our governments to do the right thing. We have to be ever vigilant for this thing to work. That being said, we are speaking with Larry Hancock, and Larry Hancock is a renowned JFK researcher. It's an amazing book. I've read it 3 times now, Larry. Notes all the way through it. His book is called Someone Would Have Talked, and it is available at the JFK Lancer website, which is www.jfklancer.com, or you can also get it through Amazon.com. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about some of your research and the rash of ambulance calls that took place just prior to the JFK assassination in Dealey Plaza, and Aubrey Reich in particular. Would you mind relaying that story to the folks?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
We can go into the story. I think the story is also a very good illustration that early on, in the first 12 hours, the first 24 hours, there was a very serious job done of beginning a criminal investigation.
By the Dallas police?
By the Dallas police, by the FBI. A lot of times we tend to think negatively of these folks, and a lot of the research work does, but it becomes a bit situational. It's not that they didn't start out. In fact, there was a memo issued within hours telling the FBI to go to all of its criminal informant sources, its race crime sources, basically to go to all of its sources and start collecting information. And certainly they were beginning a serious investigation. Certainly the Dallas police began a serious investigation looking at possible conspiracy. I think we can get into this after I answer your question, but I think it's amazing to understand that the first charges that were drafted in Dallas, the first legal paperwork charged with Lee Oswald as murdering the president as part of a communist conspiracy.
Wow.
And that paperwork was torn up under instructions from Lyndon Johnson's aide calling from Washington, D.C.
So they meddled right away, right at the very beginning, Washington. They got right into it and meddled right away.
I cover this in the book, there were a whole series of telephone calls that came from Johnson's aide, and basically, if anybody argued with him, it's like, would you like me to put the president on the phone?
And Johnson himself made a phone call, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And these calls went to various law enforcement people in Dallas and in Texas in general, literally telling them that they were not to pursue charges or not to pursue a conspiracy. That there were national security implications and foreign relations implications, and it just didn't matter. They were to stop it. They had Lee Oswald, and they should just go with that.
All these years later, do you feel that that was legitimate? I was going to ask you about Johnson, but maybe we'll do that now and then come back to Aubrey Reich.
Well, actually, it'd be better to tackle them separately. It's interesting that you asked that, because this is one of the things. When I started the book, I had no intention of really dealing with Johnson or the post-assassination, and again ended up writing about a third of the book on that. Largely because we got access to some wonderful news sources, such as all of the oral histories, the presidential phone transcript.
That's right.
The presidential daily diaries, and it just became possible to do a much deeper insight into what he was doing and thinking. So if we could come back to that, that would be...
Absolutely.
But on Aubrey Reich, and Reich's story reflects the fact that the FBI itself, for a period of time, was doing some serious investigation. He actually, and he did not realize it at the time, because they did it in a very sophisticated fashion, they called different shifts of his ambulance company, because what they were checking on was the fact that apparently there were a string of different calls made for several days prior to November 22nd. And these calls were all calls made to the ambulance company and reporting an accident at the corner of Houston and Elm Street in Dallas, which is the intersection directly adjacent to the Texas School Depository where Lee Oswald worked. And whoever was doing this was pretty sophisticated. They obviously, if you made a lot of calls, people would start wondering what was going on. So they would call at different times a day, different shift operators, different dispatchers. And so nobody at the ambulance company really began to think anything strange was going on. But the FBI saw the pattern. And obviously the FBI's initial thought, or apparently, was that someone was testing just exactly how long it would take to get an ambulance to the scene right in the middle of that intersection.
That's right. That's what I would think right away.
Right. And so now the interesting thing is, of all the FBI reports we've seen, the FBI reports of them checking out the ambulance company aren't there.
Whoa.
So it's another set of investigation reports, and there are lots of holes like this where they apparently did something and it didn't make it into the record. But Aubrey Reich was one of the ambulance drivers, and Aubrey actually ended up, on the day of the assassination, making a run to that intersection because a man had collapsed on the street. And the timing was such, and most people don't realize this, that the ambulance arrived at that intersection, drew everyone's attention for about 10 minutes, and this happened no more than 15 minutes before the arrival of the motorcade. In fact, you can, in some of the films of the motorcade, the first films of the motorcade show the ambulance departing. It was almost there. The interesting thing is the motorcade itself was several minutes late. If the motorcade had been on its scheduled time, the ambulance would have been in the middle of the intersection when the motorcade showed up. Incredible,
isn't it?
Of course, that diverted everyone's attention, including the police's attention. If there had been serious security in place, it would have diverted it.
That's right.
And so this was Aubrey's experience. I mean, his experience is broader than that, because later on He ended up at Parkland Hospital with Jackie Kennedy and in the emergency trauma area, and which is all very interesting. But this particular ambulance call, I think, is a good indication of something suspicious going on that was investigated, which is missing from the FBI record, and it's just an example of since it didn't have anything to do with Lee Oswald, it didn't become important over the long run.
Do you need to take a break? Do you want to take a break for a few seconds? Get some water, or are you good to go?
No, I think I'm okay.
Yeah, okay. Great. You're a trooper, man. Way to go.
All right. Yeah, thanks. And I guess I just close out that point. I mentioned that the instruction that went out to all the FBI offices to go out to their informants and PCIs and criminal informants and look for information. That order was rescinded the following morning, I think probably before 11 o'clock. So it's just another indication of something was started, but something was stopped before very long. Because it becomes clear, and we've talked to numerous FBI people, that the way things worked was that once J. Edgar Hoover got a lead, which they did have a solid lead on Lee Oswald, that's where he directed all of the attention. And so basically anybody that was pursuing anything else, they might have taken reports. And of course they did take reports, but as far as their own proactive investigative work, it was all focused on Oswald.
Completely on Oswald.
We see the same thing. I'm currently working on a book on the Martin Luther King assassination.
Oh, go ahead and plug that. Please do.
Yeah, we see the same thing there. It's just a pattern of behavior. Once Hoover had a named suspect, it's a matter of declaring victory. We've cracked the case, we've got the guy, and any FBI field office that was putting energy and resources where their leads was instructed that they were wasting their time.
Same pattern repeated.
And the pattern is repeated, and we've actually got a memo from Hoover on some of the suspects we're looking at in the MLK thing that says exactly that. You people are wasting your time. There's no need to develop these leads further. Go look for so-and-so.
We had Peter Dale Scott on, and he was alluding a little bit to the MLK assassination and those facts, particularly the Canadian aspect, how he was able to adopt true Canadian identities in Toronto when he made his escape, talking about James Earl Ray, who was the supposed assassination of Martin Luther King.
And we're looking very heavily at some Canadian connections on that. It leads you in the direction of some people that were very adept in identity creation. We're looking at some folks apparently whose mainstream may have been identity theft from people coming in from Hong Kong and illegal immigration from China to Canada.
Wow.
And James Earl Ray seems to have been staying at a location that was used and well known to these people.
Wow.
And probably Peter Dale mentioned it, but did he mention the quote-unquote fat man?
No, he did not. No.
Well, one of the things that was very curious is that James Earl Ray had a visitor at the rooming house, and the visitor brought him his Canadian identification and travel paperwork and everything. And when it was investigated afterwards, apparently the man said that he had found all of this left in a phone booth, which, might lead you to be a bit suspicious. But they wrote it off. I mean, they accepted that. And later, Professor Melanson, a historian, interviewed this gentleman and asked him, if that were really true. And the man said he would have been out of his mind to say anything else because those people could get you killed. It's fascinating. It appears that the RCMP did some excellent investigative work on some of those connections, but it didn't get to the FBI, or it didn't get into the record. Let's put it that way.
Well, we're going to have you back on when that is released. No question about that, because that's, right up our alley here at CKLU 96.7 FM.
Actually, there are certainly more Canadian connections to that case, to this one, although some of them turn out to be interestingly similar. But we won't go But
No. Let's go back to the JFK, one conspiracy at a time.
Yeah, so many, so little time.
Unbelievable, isn't it? How it's all interconnected and models were used over and over again, and unbelievable.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
We are speaking with the renowned JFK researcher, Larry Hancock, and he has an amazing, groundbreaking book I urge you all to go out and get. It's called Someone Would Have Talked, and it deals specifically with people who knew about the JFK assassination prior to the assassination. And he's got all the facts, all the research right there. It's all appendicized. It's an incredible book, folks. I've read it myself 3 times, making notes, and I learned something from it each time I go through it. And we are so lucky to have him here. You can get the book at Amazon.com, or better still, go to the JFK Lancer website, which is jfklancer.com, and you can order it there. And that, I should mention, that particular website is a wealth of information, along with the Mary Farrell. Just do a Google on Mary Farrell. You'll come up with both probably the Lancer and the Mary Farrell website. Something we alluded to about 10 minutes ago now. President Johnson, did he or did he not know, in your opinion, that JFK was going to be hit prior to the assassination? There's that whole Madeleine Brown story. Do you feel like going into that?
Sure. One of the things that makes it, and it may eternally be a mystery, one of the things that makes it a mystery is that Johnson's behavior is hugely inconsistent. And that doesn't jump out to you until you start doing a sort of micro-analysis of his activities during the couple of months before the assassination, and then you almost have to track it minute by minute after the assassination. It's sort of like Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby's behavior seems very mysterious until you start laying it down on a timeline almost minute by minute, and then it becomes pretty obvious that he had an involvement. But as far as Johnson is concerned, one of the things that worries me a great bit in looking at his behavior is that supposedly the common belief and was that he was very frightened and very concerned after the assassination, that there was some kind of threat, that perhaps the Soviets had been behind it, that there was some sort of conspiracy. However, he ordered no particular security for himself.
Exactly.
When he returned to the airport, to Air Force One, and got on the plane, he didn't call for any special security. The plane was protected by no more than members of the Secret Service detail that happened to be with him, and they stayed on the ground for
exactly. He was certainly in no rush to get off. Yep.
Right, totally unlike the behavior of President Bush after 9/11, where he got in the air and stayed in the air, and so you would almost expect that Johnson, if he were that concerned, would have been called for some military protection or gotten in the air or done something, but he shows no sign of it, and as a matter of fact, in the next several hours, shows no sign. There's no call from Johnson to the National Security Center, to any of the military commanders, no inquiry about a increased state of readiness. There's just absolutely no sign that he's worried about anything other than politics.
Completely
and that
perplexing.
Through the entire evening, where after he returned to Washington, D.C., he went to his office, made a lot of politically oriented phone calls, and ended up with several of his aides and supporters at his own home until about 4 a.m. in the morning, in bed, where he was in bed. They were sitting around, and basically they're talking politics. So it seems to be very inconsistent behavior. Another inconsistency is that folks would not know unless you're really into 60s history, but Johnson was very much at risk due to a political scandal in the months before the assassination relating to Bobby Baker, and it had to do with influence peddling and government contracts, and it could have exposed Johnson and probably led to his the end of his political career, possibly prison. And there's several investigations going on, including investigations within Congress, and we can look at his record and see that during this period of time, he was talking to his lawyers, and he was just obsessed with this investigation and case that is going on, and he was getting calls from President Kennedy, and it was a large problem for him. And then at the end of October, it's all over. He never makes another telephone call to his lawyer. He goes back to Texas, starts fishing, starts going to football games, and it's like the world has changed for him. And so it's another inconsistent behavior, and leads to speculation of whether or not he might have heard something that took the pressure off. And one of the things that we found in the record, and it's pretty clear if the investigation had continued, we actually found a document recording him meeting with Bobby Baker in the vice president's office and the head of the companies where the influence peddling had been done. And if that had been introduced, it would have doomed him, and it was in the official record. It would have been hard for him to avoid it. So he was certainly at risk. His behavior after the assassination, again, as I was saying before, it starts to boggle the mind. When he got back to Washington, D.C., Secretary of Defense actually went out to meet him at the airport. And as I say, supposedly the common thought is that he was extremely concerned. And we know that later on he would privately tell people that he thought there was a conspiracy.
That's right, yeah.
And some very strange behaviors, but I'll get to that in just a minute. But his first remarks to the Secretary of Defense, when the Secretary of Defense, goes up to him, is Johnson simply said something like, anything going on I ought to know about? Which does not seem to display a huge amount of concern.
At all.
So that troubles me. When you combine that with the fact that it is very clear that he did begin suppressing any investigation of a conspiracy within hours with those telephone calls, I certainly would never accuse him of being personally involved, but it's clear that he didn't want a thorough investigation for whatever reason. Whether he was concerned that it would precipitate a national security crisis or conflict with the Cubans or the Soviets, or for whatever reason, there's just a lot that we don't know to explain his actions.
And later on in an interview with CBS, Walter Cronkite, he made reference to the fact that he always thought there was a conspiracy with the JFK assassination. The interview was going to go to air, and then he called CBS and asked them to pull it on the grounds of national security, and that's bizarre in itself.
It is bizarre. I think in his behavior immediately, one of the Kennedy aides that was still working in the White House within a few days after the transition reported that he had been working late at night in his office cleaning out some paperwork and files. Johnson just came wandering by in his night clothes and started talking to him about the fact that it was President Kennedy had been essentially struck down by God for having aided in the coup against Diem that had resulted in being killed, and that Kennedy had brought it on himself. So there were some very strange things going on in the man's mind.
Scary stuff. Scary stuff. I was going to ask you, why did you become a researcher in the first place? Were you always into journalism?
Must be a character flaw of some sort.
A love of poverty? Is that it?
Yeah.
People ask me, why are you a musician? I say, love of poverty.
There's an obsessive-compulsive thing going on somewhere there. Yeah, I've often told people the problem you have is that you really can't understand it without becoming obsessive about the details.
Exactly.
And as soon as you become obsessive about the details, obviously nobody will listen to you because you're obsessive. No, for myself, I guess I was a history major, and maybe I was a frustrated history major because after that I spent the rest of my career in everything from adult education to spending technical education, computer and communications industry, to the last 20 years or so being in marketing and public relations. But as you mentioned, being a child of the 60s and out of the 60s and Cold War history, military history, has always been fascinating to me. And I don't know exactly what to blame it on. During a certain point in my career, I was traveling to Dallas a lot, and actually was in Dallas when they were filming for the movie. But wasn't really that interested at the time. But as I was traveling through Dallas, I happened one time to buy a book at a bookstore, and the book was by a fellow who claimed to have been personally involved, and he cited names of people that were involved. And for some reason, it just grabbed my attention that possibly it would be possible to know the real names, and it never occurred to me that you could even think about that, and that just sort of got me hooked. And now, later on, I came to conclude that the entire book was totally bogus, but, that's the way it goes.
But books are a great inspiration. You're absolutely right. And yours is also.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Larry Hancock is with us this afternoon, folks. You're listening to Night Fright on CKLU.ca. His book is fabulous. You've really got to go out and get it. It is called Someone Would Have Talked, and it deals specifically with people who knew about the JFK assassination prior to the assassination, which is all smoking guns in my opinion. Larry Hancock can be heard at a conference coming up in Dallas, and it's an annual conference. It's been going on for a little over 20 years, and you could get all the information in Larry's book at the JFK Lancer website, which is www.jfklancer.com. And it's just a great website. There's lots of information there. You can go to the conference. There's all kinds of information on the guests that will be there. And Larry will be there discussing some new research. It's a great place to be to find out what is the latest information in the JFK assassination. What have all the researchers come up with? Something I have to give kudos to all the researchers right across the board is they've done it on their own time. This is not a government agency, folks, or have anything to do with the government. And this is coming back to Larry's quote, which I just love, which is responsibility for the truth empowers the individual. All these people have gone out on their own time, their own expenses to do the research, to find out what exactly happened in Dallas that day. And we now know. We now know concretely that it was indeed a conspiracy. Let's go back to another story. Joseph Miltier.
Miltier is very interesting because this reveals another side, and something I mentioned earlier about the fact that it was known that JFK was at risk. And I think to respond to your early comment, I think this takes us into the fact that one of the reasons that it's very hard for the government to investigate itself is if in the process they find something that is actually not suspicious but simply a mistake, it's very hard for that to deal with that mistake. Agencies and bureaus simply do not like to admit that they made a mistake. And they don't like to admit that they don't have the analysis capability to pull their data together. There are lots of things where you just don't want to face up to it.
9/11.
And it continues. And that's the 9/11 Commission suffers from the same problem. And it's terrible to see the 9/11 Commission take various agencies and departments to task for not sharing information with them. But it's the same pattern over and over again. And I've recently read a fascinating book on the Bin Laden family, and one of the remarks that was made in it was that the FBI had done a beautiful job in collecting information about funding for Bin Laden at a field office level. But they had no ability to pull it together and to analyze it and really to do anything with it. Because that's just not the way they're investigative. They don't do analysis. And we see the same thing 45 years back. it didn't change. The field offices and individual agents can do a wonderful job, and they can warn people about things, but the system itself gets in the way. And it struck me that that was the same thing that we see in 1963, the same thing we see in 1968, and I don't think anybody really wants to admit that the system has those sorts of problems. But so back to Joseph Miltier. The Miltier, and this incident happened in Miami, Florida. It just so happens that the Miami police and the FBI were both using this individual as an informant, and he's primarily an informant on racial matters. He had very good sources within the Klan, within the National States Right Party, within the ultra-right wing, basically.
Can I just ask you, Larry, around what year? Was it 63?
Oh, the incident we're going to happen is in the fall of 1963.
Just prior to the assassination.
Before the assassination.
Thanks, Larry.
And they had been working with this informant, and they had been investigating a group of people on the ultra-right who appeared to be plotting against the president, and actually appeared to have plans against the president and several government leaders, and it appeared to be a pretty serious plot. And so Miltier was one of the ultra-right folks involved within this network, and the FBI set up and essentially did a sting on him and taped the conversation. And during the conversation, Miltier talks about the fact that some of the people he knows are indeed plotting against the president, and there are plans to shoot him, and to shoot him with a high-powered rifle from a tall building and have a patsy in place to cover it up, which obviously sounds very much like Dallas. And at first, again, when we were looking into it, it became sort of suspicious because it appeared that that information didn't get shared with anyone. Well, in the last year or so, and because of my MLK work, it's now clear that it did indeed get reported, but it reflects another systems problem. Basically, during the conversation, Miltier talks about the fact that this attack might well occur in Washington, D.C. So what happened was that the FBI passed the information on to the Secret Service to Washington, D.C., the city, not the agency.
No.
And the way that the Secret Service worked at the time was they had threat files compartmentalized by city. So if you were making a trip to Dallas, you would pull the card file for Dallas. And if there were no recent threats, well, okay, that's fine. There was no analysis arm, essentially, that it's as if they didn't have the concept that a threat in one part of the country could travel.
Now I understand.
So they didn't see this as a threat. And what's even worse is Miltier's, this incident occurred, I think, a matter of a couple of weeks in early November before the assassination, a matter of days before the FBI received another threat report from San Antonio, Texas, from an individual who was part of the same network that Miltier was, who again was talking about a rifle attack or an attack on the Kennedy during his trip to Texas. And that was reported, but strictly in San Antonio. Again, it would kind of amaze you. It's sort of like, well, do we think someone could travel from San Antonio to Dallas? No, guess not. But that's the way the system worked.
Yeah.
So the Miltier threat is one of several threats that were in play that didn't get handled correctly. It's clear now that the Secret Service received a report of a potential threat to the president from Cubans in Chicago, and that was taken very seriously, and that it's very likely that those records were either concealed or destroyed after the assassination, unlike the Miltier matter, because it was very serious, and any number of people may have known about it. It's frightening to record when the House Select Committee investigated this particular sets of reports. They actually went back and interviewed several of the people from the Chicago office, including the secretaries who had typed up the reports.
Mm-hmm.
And the response among all of them was that they simply didn't remember any of it. Including when they questioned the secretary whose initials are typed on the report.
Unbelievable, eh?
It's unbelievable in the fact that all of us have pretty much forgotten everything about the 60s and 70s and 80s except the assassination of the president. And it's very questionable that if you typed up a report about a threat to the president in November of 1963, that you would forget it.
I can't see how it would be possible.
Or if you were the agent in charge of the office, you would forget it. You know, it just, and that is backed up by the fact, and something that we haven't talked about. We have not talked about the Assassinations Record Review Board that was convened in the 90s as part of the JFK Record Act to go back and collect documents and try to obtain documents that had been kept from public scrutiny by bureaus and agencies. But
well, let's talk about that if you'd like. But before we do, I would like to just mention that you are listening to CKLU 96.7 FM, and we are speaking with renowned JFK researcher Larry Hancock. Larry Hancock has a great book out called Someone Would Have Talked, which is available at www.jfklancer.com, jfklancer.com. I also was going to ask you, Larry, do you know anything about a hidden FBI report that finally came out through a Freedom of Information Act request in the 70s about two shooters being chased from the grassy knoll 2 days prior to the assassination? They were, I guess, adjusting their scopes. Do you know anything about that report?
I do.
Is that bogus or is...
No, it's factual. It's another one of those. As I mentioned before, there are several reports of things that were investigated in Dallas that are no longer in the record that we hear about either anecdotally or from parties that were involved. And they talk about the investigation being done, but then when you go to look for the police report, it's not there. Other examples are the fact that supposedly the officers took down the names of everyone in the Texas theater where Oswald was captured. That list is not in evidence.
Oh, my.
Officers took down the names of all the cars and people that were in the parking lot behind the grassy knoll fence. That list is not in evidence. Photos of the Dallas crime scene unit examining a bullet strike on the side of Elm Street beyond the motorcade, which would have been another shot.
That's right. I've seen those.
They obviously did that because the photos exist and show the kit in place and a view back of the school book depository. That report's not in evidence. The reason we know about the incident that you mentioned is because the 112th Military Intelligence Group, which was the intelligence group that served the region that Dallas and Texas was in, had a very close liaison with Dallas police. And there's actually a 112th report that talks about this incident. So they had heard about it from Dallas police, and they're essentially reporting it because it sounds suspicious. Well, so obviously there was a report, and in essence, the Military Intelligence Group report talks about the fact that I think approximately 4 days before the assassination, two men in a car were observed in the fence on the grassy knoll in the plaza, and they had a rifle, and they appeared to be sighting in the rifle, which we went into that, but it's not something that you would naturally do in downtown Dallas. There's a lot of empty land around Dallas where you can do this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But some people reported them because it looked suspicious, and the police went around behind them because they were going to try to capture them or take them into custody and question them. But because of the buildings and everything, the people saw them and managed to drive away through the backs of the parking lots and get away from them. So it's pretty clear that the incident happened. How suspicious it is, perhaps it's coincidence, but it definitely happened, and it is definitely not. I have heard it's been expressed that because there was not an arrest that means that there would not be an incident report filed. And so there really wouldn't be there wasn't a formal telephone report filed in from the people. Somebody just got an officer and said, these guys over here have a gun. And since they didn't catch him, so perhaps there is no paperwork. But obviously, they talked about it, and they thought it was suspicious after the assassination, and somebody should have investigated it and documented it, but that didn't happen.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesdays from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, and from 10 until midnight at night. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
To me, it's a smoking gun again. There's no question. I mean, coincidence, like you said. Who's going to be in downtown Dallas citing a rifle?
Yeah, and it's, I guess the thing that's clear is when I talk to people that don't believe there could have been a conspiracy and are just totally comfortable with the investigations and conclusions, it's like, how could you be comfortable knowing about incidents like this? You might argue with me that there was a conspiracy, but it's really hard to argue that there was a thorough investigation.
Absolutely. Larry, we're coming up to the end of the show. We've got about 10 minutes left. I was just wondering, is there something that you would like to discuss?
Well, I was going to say we might wrap up just by talking about, we talked briefly about the Assassination Records Review Board, or I mentioned it at least, and I think this is important for people to know about because not much has been heard about the work of this organization, and it did have some excellent investigators. They did some great collection of documents, interviews. It's actually due to the interviews that were done by Doug Horn, which was one of the committee staff, that we know that much of the autopsy work, much of the medical record is incomplete and may be considered to be not accurate.
Can I just interrupt for a sec? The Assassination Review Board was during the Clinton administration, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. It was part of the JFK Records Act to the extent that the Records Act called for the collection and documentation of records, and this board was set up to help pursue that and to make it happen. And as part of their work, they not only tried to collect the records, but they tried to go back when they could and interview certain parties and collect oral histories. And so they did do a lot of work with the medical personnel that were still alive, and they found a lot of conflicting remarks. Among one thing that has turned up, for example, that again would make most people suspicious is that we realized before that the autopsy notes of both doctors no longer exist. One was supposedly burned by one doctor. The other was apparently just lost by one doctor. We knew before that the first draft of the autopsy report was also missing because it was supposedly burned by the doctor who wrote it and never turned in. Well, due to the work of the ARB, we know that the entire first report is missing. And it becomes clear that the report that we have now is generations away from what was first written for whatever reason. And that starts making you really question things. The interviews made it also very clear that when you interviewed all the medical staff, that the wounds that we see in the existing photos and x-rays do not represent what most of the witnesses describe. So it raises great questions about the actual wounds and why the record wouldn't be clear in one of the most obviously relevant or meaningful autopsies ever performed. So I guess one of the reasons I thought I would close on that is actually I don't think that my personal view was without the work of the 90s, the Records Act, the ARB, the oral histories that were taken, some of the revelations that we've had in the 90s, it was probably only towards the end of the 90s that one could take a stab at writing a solid work on the assassination.
Mm-hmm.
People made great efforts in the first decades, and the first-generation people gave it a tremendous shot, but they just didn't have the data that we began to accumulate by the end of the last decade.
That's right. Yeah.
So that makes a huge difference. And one of the things, it's an anecdote, but I think it pretty well sums up some of the shock value that you got out of the work of the ARB is the fact that Doug Horne, who I'm just mentioned,
mm-hmm.
one of the things that he did is that he's spoken at our conferences, and I have a great deal of admiration for him. He pointed out the fact that they had done a briefing for all of the government agencies, and that basically that the law says that you're not to destroy any more records. You're to give them to us. We'll review them. Don't
mm-hmm.
destroy anything further, and don't throw anything away. Here's our legal charter.
Yeah, hear that, Secret Service?
Hours after they have briefed the Secret Service, he later finds out that they have destroyed several boxes of travel records from the fall of 1963.
Isn't that incredible?
That just doesn't make any sense. And what it also shows you is that, I certainly don't believe that the conspirators from 1963 are still walking around destroying records in 1994.
Mm-hmm.
But it does tell me that, again, there's material and files within bureaus and agencies that would reveal mistakes, errors, activities that those agencies and bureaus just are not comfortable with bringing public. The people who destroyed those records in 1994, and Horne talks about the fact that they could have been prosecuted, didn't do it because they were part of a conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't fathom that. But obviously, we now know that there were threats in play, and there were threats and possibly protective actions in play. It looks like there's evidence that actually there was increased protection for the president in late October and November, and they just missed it. It again reminds me a lot of 9/11, where there were actually actions in play, and we lost. Someone got the best of them, and just they'd rather not that be publicly discussed and a movie made about it.
One last question, Larry, and then we're going to wrap up the show. Who do you believe killed JFK?
I am not a believer in a huge conspiracy.
Mm-hmm,
I believe that it was a relatively small group of people, and this is where we go back to John Martino, where we started. It's actually what I believe is John Martino's description is accurate. So it's not that I studied all of this and came up with what I believe. What I did was to study it and come up with what he said is what I believe. And there's a basic difference there because I didn't start out with a theory. And what he describes is the fact that a group of Cuban exiles who believed that Kennedy had betrayed them at the Bay of Pigs were informed that Kennedy was going through another series of negotiations with Castro, through back-channel negotiations, which he was, and was about to reach some sort of accommodation with Castro that would probably result in the Russians leaving, the blockade being lifted, some sort of normalization of relations, but would essentially acknowledge Castro in power. And so basically these people were fed the information by some senior CI officers who they trusted, and were essentially led to the conclusion that if Kennedy was not eliminated, they would have lost. Castro would have won, and Kennedy was a traitor. And this combination of people, aided and abetted by some of the folks that they had been using to try to kill Castro, brought about the act.
Well, it sounds plausible to me. Folks, we've been speaking with Larry Hancock. I want to thank you, Larry, so very, very much for taking the time out of your day to come on our show. You're very welcome anytime. You want to come on, just give me a phone call, send me an email, and you are on. It's been great. I just want to mention Larry's book once more. It's called Someone Would Have Talked, and of course it deals specifically with people who knew about the assassination prior to the assassination, and that's the key point, which points, of course, to a conspiracy and not just a lone nutter, Lee Harvey Oswald. It's been fantastic. I mean, I've learned so much, and I'm sure my audience has too. The JFK assassination, it is 45 years, and all the rumors you have ever heard are true. Thanks for listening to Night Fright. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
You take care, my friend. All the very best always.
Bye.
Bye now.
You're listening to Night Fright, Wednesday nights from 10 to midnight on CKLU 96.7 FM. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio.